Good evening. Thank you for joining me for this Bible study this evening. Today is Wednesday, April the 29th, 2020, and we're here to study the Bible for a few minutes. As you know, we have been studying the subject of biblical inspiration, and in fact, this study tonight is part 5 of that study. But you can also look at it like this. Today is part 2 as we delve into the credentials supporting biblical inspiration. I want you to suppose tonight that you are a woman, and some of you are tuning in and you're watching and you're a part of this Bible study this evening, and you're already a woman, so you don't have to pretend, but for the rest of us, we do have to pretend. So suppose you're a woman and you found yourself stranded in a dark alley late at night in the middle of Los Angeles, California. Keep in mind, there are barely any lights. And up ahead of you, a group of young men, about 5 or 6, emerge from a doorway into the alley. Keep in mind, it's dark. You can only see their shadows, and they're laughing and they're talking about this and that, and you really can't make out exactly what it is that they're talking about. And they begin walking in your direction. You would probably start feeling a little bit nervous. Would it make any difference to you? Would your comfort level change at all if you knew that these young men were coming from a Bible study? Of course it would make a difference. Because you see, the Bible influences people to be good and kind and respectful and thoughtful. The Bible reminds us that we have to answer to a higher power. More than likely, these young men would probably render whatever assistance they could to you because you're in a little bit of trouble and you're walking in an alley in Los Angeles in the middle of the night. Such is the nature of the Bible. Men and women are invited to be better people. Wherever the Bible has gone, whenever it is sincerely believed, lives are changed for the better. In our last study, I suggested to you that the Bible is like a compass. A compass is always going to point to true north. It doesn't point to me, it doesn't point to you, it always points to something outside of itself. A compass is a very useful tool. It can even save your life. The Bible is also a compass. It's like a compass, at least. It points us to God. The Bible is showing us the way to God. And as it shows us the way to God, it's also showing us the way into life. To use another metaphor, the psalmist said in Psalm 119, verse 105, "Your word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path." The question is, can we trust the Bible to get us safely to our destination? You know, there are any number of proofs or points of evidence that we could cite to show us that the Bible is accurate, that it's reliable, ultimately pointing us to God Himself, who is the author of the Bible. I think when we look at the Bible's unity and the harmony of its composition and its storyline, that this is a powerful witness that the Bible can be trusted and that it's beyond human production. Also, the Bible is always correct in those areas that it addresses, the areas of history, for example, and geography, which we mentioned last week, which is a huge point because there is so much of history and so much geography in the Bible. But now I want to ask, what about science? What about medicine? Can we find evidence for biblical inspiration in these areas as well? Let me explain something that is actually very important. The Bible is not a science book. It's not a medical reference work. It doesn't even pretend to be. Those of us who believe the Bible to be inspired need to be very careful not to unduly press the statements of the Bible into the mold of science and medicine. I have 2 reasons for this caution. First of all, we want to be fair. We want to be fair to both science and the Bible. It helps no one to misinterpret either one. Sometimes the Bible speaks poetically. Sometimes it speaks figuratively. It makes no effort to speak to us in the vernacular of science. This has to be taken into account in our assessments of biblical statements. Incidentally, even scientists themselves use figurative language from time to time, like when they speak of the sun rising and setting. And just because they use figurative language doesn't mean that they should be dismissed or kicked out of their scientific societies. They're just using figurative language, and everyone understands that. And that's the way we ought to understand the Bible as well. Secondly, though, the God of the Bible is a God of miracles, and reasonably so. The God who established the laws of nature has no problem suspending them or manipulating them as he wishes. We're not in a very good position to tell God what he can or cannot do. God operates beyond the realm of science, and the biblical writers are not shy in telling you about those events. Like when people were healed by looking at a brazen snake in Numbers chapter 21. Like when Jacob was able to increase the number of his livestock by having the animals look at striped poles in Genesis chapter 30. These are occurrences that have absolutely nothing to do with the normal operation of nature. This is just God doing what he wishes to do for his purposes. Science is limited in what it can tell us about God and what it can tell us about the works of God. All science can really do is look at the laws of nature and the operations of nature and what's happening in the natural world. However, whenever the Bible clearly addresses topics relative to science and medicine, it exhibits astounding accuracy. In the area of oceanography, for example, which I personally know nothing about, but this is a lot of people cite this particular example. Matthew Fontaine Murray in 1854, he discovered that the oceans were vast circulating systems caused by the interaction of wind and water and gravity. Today we can especially observe this by satellite. But long before 1854, David spoke of this in one of his psalms of praise to the God of heaven in Psalm chapter 8, verses 4 through 8. The biblical writers appear to give evidence that they knew about the hydraulic cycle involving evaporation and rainfall in Ecclesiastes chapter 11 in verse 3, and I think especially Amos chapter 9 in verse 6. The prophet Isaiah seemed to know that the earth is round. Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 22. How could he have known this? How did he know this when the prevailing theory of the day was that the earth was flat, that was a position held by some, or that it existed on the back of a turtle or on the back of an elephant? Jesus suggested that his second coming would occur during the day and also during the night. Luke chapter 17, verses 30 through 37. How did Jesus know that day and night occur at the same time? Of course, we know this today. On one occasion, David spoke of the orbit of the sun in Psalm 19, verses 5 and 6. How could David have known that? The Bible also acknowledges the important role of the woman in reproduction, Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 and verse 20, claiming that the female, not just the male, is in possession of the seed of life. What a revolutionary thing for Moses to reveal thousands of years ago. The Bible also tells us that life is dependent on blood, that life is in the blood. Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11. In this time of pandemic and physical distancing, we would do well to pay attention to some of the prescriptions found in God's law. Do you want to avoid typhoid, cholera, dysentery? Then Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 12 and 13 would probably be very helpful right now. Listen to Moses as he says this. Also, you shall have a place outside the camp where you may go out, and you shall have an implement among your equipment, and when you sit down outside, you shall dig with it and turn and cover your refuse. In Leviticus chapter 13, 14, and 15, Moses enacted very specific rules for the prevention of infection and contagious diseases, even suggesting to the children of Israel quarantine. Washing your hands and body and disposing of contaminated clothing, these are common hygienic practices today. But Moses said that these things should be done. How did Moses know about these things? Thousands of years prior to modern discovery. One of the most impressive things that I've noticed about the Bible is how it affirms two of the most fundamental laws of science. The first law of thermodynamics, which basically states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. The total quantity of energy in the universe stays the same. This law is suggested by Genesis chapter 2 and verse 1, when Moses told us that God finished his work of creation. This is why you don't have things popping into existence or popping out of existence when you take a walk in the park or you go look at the mountains and the valleys and the ocean. This is why things don't just pop in and out of existence. But then there's the second law of thermodynamics, which states that energy, as it is transferred from one state to another, changed from one state to another, that more and more of it is wasted. The second law of thermodynamics states that there is a natural tendency of any isolated system to degenerate into a more disordered state. This is why when you burn a piece of wood in your fireplace, in the energy transfer, there is a loss that takes place. So the air is heated, but only for a short period of time, and then it begins to cool. And what about that piece of wood? It immediately becomes ash, and you can't use ash for very many things. This is why you have to take your car in for repairs. This is why we all die. The Bible speaks of the second law of thermodynamics in a number of impressive ways. Speaking of the heaven and the earth and comparing them to the unchanging God, the psalmist wrote in Psalm 102, verses 26 and 27, "They will perish, but you will endure. Yes, they will all grow old like a garment, like a cloak you will change them, and they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will have no end." Poetic, to be sure, but also true. Jesus gave us this advice based on the second law of thermodynamics in Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 and 20. He said, "Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal." The second law of thermodynamics affects all of life. In fact, it affects everything you do in life, and it affects our lives every single day. But it was only discovered in the 1850s by Rudolf Clausius and William Thomson. How did the biblical writers, none of them scientists, know about these laws of nature, these laws discovered by science, except by inspiration? Understand, of course, the Bible is not a science textbook. It wasn't the purpose of the biblical writers to define and explain the laws of nature now discovered by science. They simply used the knowledge given to them by God in order to meet a higher objective, to persuade men and women to trust in the wisdom and the power of God and to demonstrate that trust in obedience to Him. Now, before I leave the subject of science and medicine, let me mention this. One of the most serious and most important attacks on the Bible comes from naturalism. This is the view that the universe exists as a closed system and that matter is all there is, and therefore God does not exist. Naturalism is the worldview behind the general theory of evolution. The Bible and the general theory of evolution are in absolute opposition. The evolution model proposes that the universe is self-contained. Everything in the universe has come into being through mechanistic processes without any kind of supernatural intervention. This view leads to a philosophy of life that asserts basically that man is his own master. The creation model, on the other hand, proposes that the universe is not self-contained. Everything in the universe came into being by the design, purpose, and deliberate act of a supernatural creator who, using processes which are not now continuing in the present, created the universe and all things that we see. This view leads to a philosophy of life that maintains that God is actually master over man, and the result is that life has purpose and meaning, and life is fulfilling. Now, many do not believe in the inspiration of the Bible because it cannot be reconciled with the general theory of evolution. If the theory of evolution is true, then it's true that the Bible cannot be inspired. The general theory of evolution is such an accepted theory that most people never question it, but they should. You know, there used to be a bumper sticker that you used to see on cars from time to time that said, "Question authority." Well, the general theory of evolution is the authority today in the fields of science and academia. Well, this is an authority that should be questioned. I meet young people on a fairly regular basis who have never heard of any other explanation for the origin of life. A wise person once said, "Don't believe everything you hear." But this does not mean that a person cannot believe the Bible and believe in science. I'm using science to broadcast this video Bible study into your home. We're surrounded by the results, technology of science. We use science every single day in order to teach the Bible, in order to help us in our study of God's Word. So don't let anyone tell you that you cannot believe in the Bible and believe in science. I'm proof positive that you can. Science observes and studies the laws of nature that God created, that God put in place. True science is opposed to naturalism, not the Bible. In fact, science's charter is found here in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, where Moses wrote this, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." This is God commanding human beings to take dominion of the earth, to care for it, and to discover all that there is to discover. So you find God's charter for science in the opening words of the Bible. We come next, in making the case for biblical inspiration, to the subject of predictive prophecy. Now, many of the biblical writers and characters made predictions concerning the future, some of them many, many years into the future. These prophecies are therefore beyond human production. They're proof that the Bible is inspired. Are human beings capable of predicting the names of men who have never been born into the future? Can human intelligence foretell the actions and characteristics of people hundreds of years in advance? Human beings cannot do these things without supernatural aid. Predictive prophecy and its fulfillment was in fact used by God as proof of his deity in controversy with false gods. We find this in Isaiah chapter 41. Prophecy was also employed as an official seal of a true prophet in Isaiah 42, Isaiah 44, Jeremiah 16, Ezekiel chapter 6, and Ezekiel chapter 14. Now, these are just a few outstanding examples. Many, many more could be given. Isaiah's prophecy about the king of Persia in Isaiah 44, verse 28, all the way through Isaiah 45 and verse 1. Isaiah gave his prophecy in 700 BC, around there, long before the king of the Medo-Persian Empire defeated the Babylonian Empire, of which Judah was a part. The following year, the king allowed the Jews to return to their homeland. Well, what's so special about that? Just that Isaiah told us this king's name, Cyrus, and what he would do 160 years before it even happened. And then there's the prophecy of Daniel. In Daniel chapters 2 and 7 and 8, in which Daniel gave us an overview of the world empires that would come after Babylon, the Medo-Persian Empire, the Greek Empire under Alexander the Great, and the Roman Empire. Daniel gave us this overview hundreds of years before these empires even came into being. How did he do that? He had to be aided by God himself. The Bible gives us dozens of prophecies like this, hundreds of prophecies like this. Prophetic statements in the Bible are so numerous that the very credibility of the Bible is at stake in this matter, on this subject. If any of the Bible's prophecies are fallacious, then we should reject the Bible. Hugo McCord well said, and I quote, "The uniqueness of the Bible is seen in that other books pertaining to religion, those of Islam, Buddhism, Confucianism, Shintoism, and Zoroastrianism, make no attempts to predict the future. The Bible, as it were, puts itself out on a limb and risks being cut off, a chance other books of religion dare not make." The prophets themselves issued the very challenge that brings the Bible to destruction if its prophecies prove to be false. From the pen of Isaiah comes this challenge to the idolaters and false gods of his day in Isaiah 41, verse 22. Here's what he said: "Let them bring forth and show us what will happen. Let them show the former things what they were, that we may consider them and know the latter end of them, or declare to us things to come." That was Isaiah's challenge to the people of his day who believed in the false gods of the nations around them. Ladies and gentlemen, the great test of all would-be deities is actually the test of the future. Only the true God can reveal to us the future, and this is exactly what the God of the Bible does, not once, but again and again and again. Now, another reason why I believe in the inspiration of the Bible is because of the character and personality of Jesus Christ. Now, there are two lines of reasoning that I want to mention at this point. First of all, there are over 300 prophecies in the Bible concerning Jesus. Some of these prophecies are obscure, even though the New Testament mentions them as prophecies of Christ, but others are quite detailed. For example, Micah chapter 5 and verse 2 gives us this: "But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from of old, from everlasting." This was a prophecy written hundreds of years before the coming of Jesus, and yet it pinpoints precisely the place of his birth. This is only possible by the inspiration of God. Both Jesus and the early preachers of the gospel appealed to the Old Testament prophecies as sure evidence that Jesus is the Son of God. These prophecies and the one they point to are all found in God's Word. They're found in the Bible, and therefore the Bible stands or falls based on the subject of fulfilled prophecy. Now, the second line of reasoning has to do with Jesus himself. No one can match Jesus in his integrity, his character, his skill, or his exemplary life. Is it really possible that the personality of Jesus was the invention of human authors? Jesus came into the world in an extraordinary way. He died to save people from their sins, and he was resurrected from the dead to give us all life. Someone once wrote this: "Here is a man who was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in another village. He worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. Then for 3 years he was an itinerant preacher. He never owned a home. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family. He never went to college. He never put his foot inside a big city. He never traveled 200 miles from the place he was born. He never did one of the things that usually accompany greatness. He had no credentials but himself." While still a young man, the tide of popular opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. One of them denied him. He was nailed. He was turned over to his enemies. He went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed upon a cross between two thieves. While he was dying, his executioners gambled for the only piece of property he had on earth, his coat. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend. 19 long centuries have come and gone, and today he is a centerpiece of the human race and leader of the column of progress. I am far within the mark when I say that all the armies that ever marched, all the navies that were ever built, all the parliaments that have ever sat, and all the kings that ever reigned put together have not affected the life of man upon this earth as powerfully as has that one solitary life. Yes, it is reasonable to believe in the inspiration of the Bible because you see, the Bible introduces Jesus to us. There have been many other arguments and evidences that have been set forth over the years for the inspiration of the Bible. Among them, arguments based on the Bible's indestructibility. It just keeps on going. Many efforts have been made over the years to destroy the Bible, but all of them have failed. Arguments based on its universal appeal and influence, arguments based on its moral superiority, and arguments from alternative possibility. That is, no one could have written the Bible except for God. Much more evidence supporting the Bible's claim to inspiration could certainly be given. It has not fallen within the scope of this study to detail all the other religious books, those of Islam or Buddhism or Shintoism or Confucianism or even the Apocrypha. But the cumulative effect of the many arguments and evidences that have been set forth through the years, these points and others, help make the case for the inspiration of the Bible. The evidence demands that the most serious skeptic take another look at the subject of inspiration. For those who are already convinced of the Bible's inspiration, this material encourages a deeper conviction and a stronger faith that God has truly revealed himself through the Scriptures. Thank you for being a part of this study tonight. I hope it's been helpful, and I hope it encourages you to study further the credentials supporting biblical inspiration